Why, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's having a great day. Thank you so much for joining us for another Naviant Solution Spotlight. Today on the topic of Workflow Approval Management. My name is Guy Schrader. I am the Manager of Sales Engineering here at Naviant, and I will be your sole presenter today. So as normal, we do have things, everybody muted within the GoToWebinar. We are recording this session, so hence the reason why we do mute everybody, so we get a really good recording. This recording will actually be posted. You'll receive a link to it after that video is actually posted, but this will be available if you'd like to come back to it and listen to it later. So if you do need to communicate, since you are muted, please use the chat box. If you have any technical issues or if you have any questions, I'll be leaving some time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So please pose those anytime during the presentation, but we'll hold those questions until the end. And as you finish up the webinar and close out of things, GoToWebinar is going to prompt you for a survey that Naviant actually puts together. So please take a few moments just to answer that survey so that we can hopefully come up with topics that you want to actually be hearing about in the future. So our agenda today for Workflow Approval Management, we have an acronym for it of WAM, W-A-M. So I'll be referring to both of those as we go along here. My typical agenda, what is it? Why would you potentially need it? How does it work? We'll actually do a relatively thorough demonstration here for how it does work. How do you get it? And then we'll leave that time at the end, as I mentioned, for Q&A. So what is WAM? Really, before I start talking about workflow approval management, I need to set the stage. We need to first talk about workflow, because workflow is a requirement of this. A lot of you probably already have workflow within your organization to be able to automate different business processes that you have. So workflow itself is configured inside the OnBase Studio. I know a number of you probably have that type of functionality, but for those that aren't aware, Studio requires an additional install, requires some additional security to be able to perform those particular functions. Now, while workflow is very powerful and it's able to handle a wide variety of different processes, there's a lot of complexity to how workflow can actually be set up within the organization. So it's a good thing, and I'm very happy that you all have workflow. But what happens when you have a variety of different approval methods, that you have very different rules that need to change potentially throughout the process, or the personnel changes actually? This causes some problems in the traditional role of just workflow only, because think what actually has to happen here. When we're dealing with workflow, you're going to have to make that request for the change to your OnBase system administrator, the person that does your workflow work, or come to Naviant and say, hey, I need to change some logic within my workflow. That may take a delay because I come from the IT ranks, so I can go ahead and disparage them. A lot of organizations always say, oh, geez, if I got to go to IT, that's going to take forever. Well, that's a common problem that we see. So it does take some time to get those changes made, but then every organization should be testing those changes. You should do this before you roll it into a production environment, because the core logic of workflow is truly changing. There can be some severe risks if you don't go through those changes. And then finally, once everybody's all happy with those changes, we deploy that into the production environment. And guess what? That takes time. It takes a lot of resources. So you are not a nimble organization as it comes to workflow modifications. And again, this is just strictly what you have inside of workflow, not to say that it's bad, but to say that could be a potential problem when you have to make some of these workflow logic changes. So now we can actually set the stage for what is workflow approval management. This is an add-on to your existing OnBase workflow. Nothing, well, I shouldn't say that. Your licensing is not going to change for OnBase workflow. You still need to keep that. But really what we're talking about doing here is now we're changing that control of a lot of that workflow logic away from your system administrators and handing that to effectively your business owners. they own the process. So this could be anybody to be able to configure those rules to evaluate the documents. And all of this is actually then done inside the OnBase Unity client, which provides for a much more typical user interface so that people don't have to learn something brand new, such as OnBase Studio and some of the complexities that come along with that. This really does allow you to now move very quickly within your organization to accelerate those document approval processes, where you can dynamically assign the different approvers that might be involved within any step of an OnBase workflow approval process. What happens is that we do need to make some changes to your workflow configuration in Studio, but all things said and done, this simplifies a lot of that workflow configuration and now offloads some of that configuration into this approval management that I'm going to show you inside of OnBase Studio. And that's where we actually configure that workflow approval management logic in the Unity client with just some elevated permissions for you, that business unit owner. So let's just do a little bit of a graphical. If we're talking about using OnBase Workflow without workflow approval management, which is probably where all of you are today, you have a process like this. And we're just using the example of accounts payable invoice processing. This frankly could be any process that you have where there might be multiple queues set up. In this particular case, we have these 6 queues that are really involved with this approval process. Think of accounts payable invoices that come in. Somebody in accounts payable takes a look at that. That's that generalist review queue. They may need to escalate those to managers for both PO and non-PO based invoices. So those could be separate queues with separate permissions, separate actions, ad hoc tasks within each of those queues. There may be some scenarios where we need to escalate that to upper management now, separate queues there, and even to the point where we now get to a vice president needing to review those invoices. 6 queues, a lot of logic built into that process somewhere within those 6 different queues inside of workflow configuration. And that can be confusing if it is truly just approval logic. We're talking about pulling that out of those 6 different queues and putting that into a single queue, which I'll show you just in a moment. So why do you need workflow approval management? Great question. If you have a scenario where your organization needs to rapidly change some of those rules and the personnel that are involved within those approvals when your business environment changes. COVID-19 is a great example. Everybody's now remote. Maybe people are doing a little bit different work. Workflow approval management really took out IT and now puts that into the hands, again, of the business owners to be able to make those changes. So a few examples. If an employee is going to be out today, workflow only, it's somewhat difficult to do that. There are capabilities inside of WAM to be able to handle delegation of work when an employee is going to be out of the office. You bring on new personnel, or you have people transitioning out of your department. Again, we don't want to change that core workflow logic, but when we use workflow approval management, that's very, very simple to do. Your work volumes change. You're going to have to adapt. Now we might be assigning things a little bit differently to our different users. Again, that's a great example for how we can use this. Or all of those rules, the logic that goes along with it needs to be changed due to your business adjustments for whatever the case might be. So that, again, another nice benefit. And really one of the big things for those people that are really familiar with OnBase, any changes that you have to make inside of OnBase Studio requires that you do at least a reset server cache within Studio. I know I'm talking technical here, but that does temporarily boot everybody out of the OnBase system when that happens. That goes away when we're talking about using workflow approval management. And again, the key here is that we're transferring that power away from the OnBase system administrator, but now to the business unit manager to make all of these changes. And again, allows our employees to delegate their work during those planned absences. Looking at that same graphic that we had before, really your queue logic changes. We can take away the specific approval queues and put that into a single approval queue. And given there's some different capabilities within the system to be able to handle any of those other exceptions or errors or anything else that comes along the way. So again, it can simplify your workflow for what it looks like. So a few slides here for how things work. Now, given when we introduce WAM into your environment, there's a number of new functions that are going to be exposed inside of workflow configuration. And what that really means is that, yes, you're going to have to consider making changes to your existing life cycles, your workflow, to be able to utilize some of these functions. So to talk through this, these are new concepts that are available inside of OnBase Studio. There's approval processes, approval rules, and different queues. And we're not going to talk through all of these and explain it. Obviously, there's more training that you can do here. I just wanted to introduce the topics to you today. But those approval processes, I'll show you a little bit more about that in a few moments, as well as the approval queues when I get into the demo. There's also new actions and rules that are going to be exposed within workflow configuration once you have WAM licensed in your environment. And again, we need to consider making these changes inside of your existing life cycles, or as we configure new life cycles, we have to take them into consideration. So there's a handful of new actions that are associated. So workflow actions, you should be familiar with that to a certain extent. There's 12 new ones that come into play here, and really that third one, approve reject item, is the core component to this. When a user effectively clicks on an ad hoc task, we'll configure this approve/reject item as one of the actions, and that will then continue the logic based upon how it's configured to move it on to the next user, or now we get to the point where we're saying that this document, this item has been approved. There's additional rules too. Not nearly as many of them, but you can see that there's some things for checking approval levels and statuses, and whether this item has been in a specific approval process. So with all that being said, now we're moving on to the Unity client side. WAM introduces approval management that we'll actually see. Last slide before we get to the demo, I promise you that. That approval management button that's going to be there will grant appropriate permissions to the individuals that need to be able to modify the logic of any of these approval processes. That's available within the Unity client. So within that approval management in the Unity client, there's some new concepts to talk about: approval paths and path rules, approval levels and level rules, and approvers and user rules that go along with that. And again, don't want to get into all the details here. It is something different to learn as we configure WAM, but I think once you would actually get into it, it makes a lot of sense. It's just some different verbiage for how this needs to take place. So let's get into a little bit of a demonstration here. I am starting in OnBase Studio and kind of working in the same order that we talked about just a few moments ago. Excuse me. So if you're familiar with Studio, you see all of our life cycles on the left side of the screen here. There's some additional capabilities over here, and then we have the ribbon bar based upon the context that's selected up here. For starters, you'll see that we have approval processes and approval roles. I'm really going to talk about the approval process here as I show this to you. I've configured an approval process for this AP invoice approval. Really, it's a little wizard that we walk through to set this up, where you have to give it a name and a description, which document types potentially can come through this approval process. Here, accounts payable invoices. Who are my different OnBase users, or actually the user groups, frankly, that can configure the approval process within the Unity client? So here I've just given this to our AP users as well as manager. Obviously, you can go very far here for saying different groups have different capabilities. But then who are our different users that are going to be approvers? So you can see a few different lines there. That AP users, that's truly an OnBase user group. The NAV CFO, the NAV clerk, those are approval roles, which, go figure, would be configured, if I can get my mouse over there, up here under the approval roles. And this is where we're saying we're creating a new role called NAV CFO and then assigning different OnBase users to this. So we don't have to mirror the specific to the OnBase user groups. We have a lot of flexibility. What are the keyword types that are potentially going to be used for evaluating our documents as they go through that approval process? And we just add them off the list down at the bottom. I'm not going to talk about the form fields here, but that does allow us to map any Unity forms any fields that are not set up as keywords to be utilized within this approval process, also similar to keyword types. We have notifications. So we can natively set up a workflow notification. We'll actually use it within this approval process so that when an item gets assigned to an individual within that approval queue, they will get that particular notification. And we don't actually have to include that within the workflow configuration itself. And there's some options here. Notice I have this enable delegation turned on. What I'm saying here is that a user, if they're going to be going out on vacation or they know that they're going to be out of the office, they have the ability to come into the Unity client and turn on that flag saying, I'm out, delegate all of my work now to this individual, and everything from that point forward be assigned to them. And I'll show you that, how we do that from the user client perspective. So now that we're actually in workflow, we're talking about this AP, Naviant, Invoice Demo, WAM. Notice I have my approval queue already selected. These are going to be queues that you might have normally, but notice you now have a new option of a approval queue. That's what this approval queue that we see just down here has been set up as. And what that does is that brings up some different context on the right-hand side here for my properties. Which approval process is being used? When an approval has taken place, all of those levels and the rules have been satisfied, where does that particular item go to? In my case, it goes to the non-PO ready to post. If somebody rejects an item, where does it go? It goes to my rejected queue, so on and so forth for some other scenarios. If there's errors or even if there's an auto approval, there can be an auto approval queue, meaning all of the rules are satisfied before any individual even has to take a look at this. So a lot of flexibility there for how that's configured. And then we actually get into that particular queue. I'm still in my approval queue, but you can see I've set up an ad hoc user task called approve. Here is my specific action for the approve invoices. And we can see over on the right-hand side here, there's one of those action types to approve or reject that particular item that, in this case, we're saying that this is status of approved. That would move things on for the next evaluation. Does somebody else need to review and approve this? Here's just a handful of those 12 different approval action types that we talked about before. Again, I've selected approve, reject, but they're all available now once you have Workflow Approval Management licensed. And conversely, if we reject an invoice via a different ad hoc task, we're using that same approve, reject item, but notice that my status is specifically noted as rejected. So that's what needs to happen inside of the studio for any of our workflow configuration. We need to set up the approval process at minimum. We need to set up an approval queue, and then we need to utilize some of those actions within that approval queue to approve and or reject this particular item. So switching hats here, let's go into the Unity client. And the first thing that you should notice is up on the ribbon bar, we now have an approval management button in the workflow group. Only those users that are set up as the individuals that can modify the approval process have access to this. And when I go in there, given I would have been prompted at this point in time to say, if I had multiple approval processes, which process do I want to be modifying? I've actually selected this Nav AP invoice approval process. And here's our logic for how we're going through that evaluation and approval of invoices. And I'm going to talk through this very, very quickly before I get any further. We have different paths. So here's just an invoice approval path, and we're always using this level. When any item first comes into the system, we're first going to check to see whether we need to assign this to our IT department, and if so, who does that go to? That goes to Chris Volk. And again, you as a system administrator can easily change these users. If the department is actually equal to operations, then we're going to go ahead and assign that to Ed Majeska. And you can rinse and repeat this in this scenario for all of your different departments, but think how you could use this elsewhere within your organization. And then I have a different level. I have a CFO approval level where if the invoice is approved by the department and the invoice total is greater than $1,000, then we're sending it on to this NAV CFO approval group. That could be multiple individuals, and there's different granularity for what we can do with this. So just to talk through a few different things here. Path rules, as I get into that, there we can again see it echoed on the right-hand side. Our conditions, all of the conditions need to be true. document type needs to be AP invoices for something to go down this particular path. Here's that assigned IT rule for the level rule. There you can see, I'm sorry, that's a user rule. And as we go in there, we can see we gave it a name, we gave it a description, and we build up the conditions here based upon everything that we see on the right side here. I'm evaluating a keyword type. The keyword is department. That's going to be equal to IT for this particular rule to be satisfied. Notice here's some of our different items that we can do. We can evaluate the document type, the keyword value, we can evaluate the Unity form, field value, or run a Unity script. So this is really going to be based upon standard things in OnBase that you're used to. Keyword values, Unity form fields, document types, so on and so forth. And that's how we're defining the logic to say that this needs to go to Chris Volk. And he's one of our approvers. I already had to add him in this particular case, but we select that particular level and we add that approver. And again, we talked about operations, how that would get assigned to Ed Majeska. Now, a different level, again, that CFO approval, we have a level rule here, where we're saying if that invoice total is greater than $1,000, then we route that to the CFO. Again, this is accounts payable. You need to think well outside that box. This is a great example to use, but this could be used, frankly, for anything specific to your organization. So what does it look like for the users when they're inside of workflow? I am starting out from the accounts payable perspective. So invoices come in some form or fashion. They're all being routed to an accounts payable clerk for review. This is not workflow approval management here. This is just natively workflow. So we're blending the two into a single life cycle. When I'm sending this department for review, I'm prompting, or at some point in time, we have to have some of those keyword values populated. So our department is equal to IT. Our invoice total is equal to $959. We're storing these as keywords on the document. And then as I click submit on this, that document goes away, is routed into that approval queue, but that workflow approval management logic that we configured is now kicking in. So second invoice here, same thing. We're still in the accounts payable hat on. This one's going to operations, a little bit over $4,000. So think what would happen in that situation. We're expecting this to be routed to Ed Majeska, but we'll also see this go to the CFO because that invoice total is over $4,000. So switching hats here. I'm now logged in as Chris Volk, our IT manager. Chris is going to get that invoice, but notice he doesn't see much within his life cycle. I've only granted him permissions to this approved queue, and he's only going to see those items that are assigned specifically to him. So there's a level of load balancing that's included within workflow approval management, only gets assigned to the appropriate individual. That he can take a look at this invoice. We can still bring along any related documents like we normally would within workflow. But when he actually approves this invoice, it's going to note that Chris has approved this, and then look to see whether there's any other levels or rules that need to be satisfied for the approval before this can move on. Switching to a different user. Now I'm in as Ed Majeska. He's my operations manager. Again, he sees very similar information, but remember, this is an invoice for $4,000 plus. So he can come in here and approve that same invoice, both following the same path, different individuals. They have a very similar interface, but everything's cleaned up very nicely, and you don't have to worry about permissions to all of these different queues that are out there. Now, as I go in as my CFO, Victor Price is his name. Notice, first thing, we're not seeing both invoices. We're only seeing that one invoice that was over $4,000. The other one did not require his approval, so he never sees that whatsoever. But here, notice we have the primary document. We have any related documents. So I had a GL coding form. I shortcutted my demo here so that we didn't show you Ed actually coding this invoice, but we still bring to the user all of the documents that they're used to seeing within whatever the workflow process might be. And via right click on that item, and this can happen anywhere inside of OnBase. You right click, select workflow, you select the approval status. That's something new that's added within workflow approval management. Then when you select this, now we can see the current status on the first page here. Ed Majeska was the first level. He approved it on the 17th at 1:48 p.m. And now it's currently sitting at a second level for Victor Price. It's pending approval. So you know everybody that's going to see this and everybody that has already handled this. You can see a history where you can see it's assigned to a path, to a level, to a specific user for each of these different areas. Given if there were any future users, that evaluation takes place right when that item enters workflow. So it knows that who this all needs to go to based upon the values that are there. There's just nothing there in this particular case. But I'm going to do something different here. We're going to say, let's reject this particular invoice because there's going to be cases where it's rejected. Where's it going to go? Okay. Now, while I'm still in here is Victor Price. Victor realizes, hey, I'm going to be out on vacation next week. I need to go ahead and delegate my work. Within your user options, that's behind the File button, there is an Approval Delegation tab that's going to be enabled here. And you can see here that I'm saying delegate my work during next week, only that particular time frame. And for this approval process, now delegate my work to Maria Wilson. They can come in here and change that user and set it. Now, given we need to make sure that Maria has appropriate privileges to this process, but she might not be involved natively within the approval, we'll allow Victor to go ahead and make that particular change. And this will happen automatically. On the 27th, everything will route to Maria. On the after the 31st, everything comes back to Victor. So it's a beautiful, nice enhancement to the system here. So now switching back to accounts payable, as they receive those items back, here's that rejected item. Okay, remember, Victor rejected that particular invoice for whatever reason. All of the other basic capabilities of OnBase are still there, such as notes and the entire document history. But separately, there goes to a different destination, that now fully approved invoice with the different levels being approved to this non-PO ready to post. And if you recall, back within my workflow configuration inside of Studio associated with that approval queue, we had that all set up for where things go when they're rejected, where things go when they are fully approved. So that's your whirlwind tour of workflow approval management. So now talking through, how do you get it? The native price of workflow approval management is $20,000 for your enterprise. You license it, it's all turned on. Given there are some requirements to this that you need to make sure that you have workflow license, so really that's your workflow clients. And keep in mind here, we're setting up that approval management inside the Unity client, hence you do need to be licensed for the OnBase Unity client for this to work properly. There are some complementary OnBase modules that I want to call out here. We usually report upon some of these processes. There is reporting dashboards available. There are specific data providers within reporting dashboards for your approval processes that now allow us to mine some of that data that happens during that approval process. So that's a nice complementary add-on. Some of you might have seen in recent versions of Foundation that OnBase has released this OnBase Accounts Payable Approval app. And what this is, it's a really nice, no footprint, web-based approver app. So think of any of your accounts payable approvers that would be involved. They can get a notification, they click on a hyperlink, it's using whatever browser on whatever device, responsive to the screen real estate that you have to deal with, where they have a really nice clean interface to go ahead and view and approve these invoices. That is built with the assumption that an organization is using workflow approval management. So I encourage you to take a little further look at that, and as normal, contact your Naviant account executive if you'd like more information on that. So a little bit of a recap here. Again, what workflow approval management really allows us to do is now move that power into the business unit owner's hands for that entire logic for who the approvers are and what the approval process might look like. Allows you to very quickly adapt to some of those changes without getting your system administrator involved, without system resets. That all happens naturally as soon as those changes are made. And it really allows those approvers to delegate their work. And before I finish up here, I just want to highlight a few additional resources if you're really interested in looking at this a little bit further, besides obviously contacting myself or contacting your account rep. There is Highland Community. There is a whole workflow approval management group. So if you just search for workflow approval management or under the products, you'll see that entire group where you have module reference guides, you have presentations, you have discussion groups, so on and so forth, that may be quite beneficial for you. Out on training.highland.com, there are a couple of premiums, there is a premium subscription course, one in English, one in Spanish, teaching you how to configure workflow approval management. And there's also a hands-on lab where you can get your fingers dirty a little bit there. And out on try.highland.com, there is that AP invoice approval app. There isn't something specifically for workflow approval management, but if you wanted to see more about that, since I mentioned it, I bring that up. With that, questions, and as I bring up my question panel to see if anybody has posed any questions to me, I do want to remind you that on August 19th, we have another Naviant seminar on making your forms digital with OnBase Unity forms and imaging forms. So that is a fabulous thing if you're using OnBase in any form or fashion to be able to use that in the future. So let me answer the one question that I have at this point in time. If I set the delegation while there are items currently sitting in my queue, will it be forwarded to the delegated person? Steve, my understanding is that there is an option that yes, I think that's set up within Studio to say what is the default behavior that when you delegate or that delegation turns on, anything that's sitting in your approval queue can move forward to that person that you're delegating to. It could be the situation where you do want to keep that assigned to the original user until they come back. I believe that is a system option from your perspective. And that's the only question that we have at this point in time. So again, thank you as always for your time. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, and I always appreciate a little bit of time, and I hope that you appreciated the content conveyed during this particular webinar, and I hope that you have a fabulous rest of your day. Thanks so much.